The dust of redemption was a fine red powder that settled on everything, a grit that worked its way into the seams of a person's soul. To Mei-Ling, it tasted of rust and endings. She sat on a rigid bench outside the saloon, a lacquered doll of polished black hair and cobalt silk marooned on an island of splintered wood. The sun was a physical weight, a blacksmith's hammer that beat the hope out of the air, leaving it thin and shimmering with heat. Men passed, their gazes lingering on her like flies on fresh meat. Some curious, some contemptuous, all of them branding her with the same unspoken word, property. She felt their eyes but did not meet them, her own fixed on the shimmering horizon where the cracked earth met a bleached-out sky. Her hands, hidden in the voluminous sleeves of her gown, were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white jade. She was a thing to be claimed, a chit won in a game of cards by a man named Silas Stone, a man whose reputation preceded him like the smell of cheap whiskey and decay. She had been waiting for 3 hours. The sun had crawled past its zenith and begun its slow, grudging descent toward the jagged peaks in the west. The shadows of the false-fronted buildings stretched like grasping fingers across the street. Inside the saloon, a piano tinkled, a discordant, melancholy tune, a soundtrack for broken dreams. Every time the bat-wing doors swung open, releasing a wave of noise in the thick stew of stale beer, sweat, and desperation, her body went rigid. She had constructed a fortress within herself, a place of cold, still calm, where the terror could not reach. But each new arrival tested its walls. Silas Stone, she had been told, was a man who enjoyed a spectacle. He would make her wait. He would want the town to see his prize. She was not just a servant. She was a symbol of his victory, a living trophy. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut, a cold counterpoint to the oppressive heat. She focused on her breathing, a technique taught to her long ago in a life that felt like it belonged to another person, another world. Inhale the dust, the heat, the humiliation. Exhale control. Then a new sound cut through the lethargy of the afternoon, the slow rhythmic plod of a single horse. It wasn't the boisterous arrival she expected of a man like Stone. This was a tired, deliberate sound. A man on a large bay gelding rode into town, a phantom emerging from the heat haze. He did not look at the saloon, nor at the mercantile or the assayer's office. His gaze was fixed forward, as if the town itself were merely an obstacle on a much longer journey. He was tall in the saddle, but stooped, as if carrying a burden that was more than the rifle in its scabbard or the bedroll tied behind him. His hat was sweat-stained and pulled low, shadowing a face that seemed carved from the same unforgiving rock as the distant mountains. Dust coated him, turning his dark clothes to a uniform shade of gray-brown, making him one with the landscape he traveled. He was the land, she thought, worn, silent, and enduring. He pulled the horse to a stop, not at the saloon's hitching post, but directly in front of her bench. For a long moment, he simply sat there, looking down at her. His face, what she could see of it beneath the brim of his hat, was a mask of hard lines and sun-cured leather. There was no avarice in his eyes, no flicker of the leering triumph she had steeled herself for. There was only a profound weariness, a quiet assessment that was somehow more unnerving than any overt threat. He dismounted, his movements economical and stiff, the protest of tired muscles audible in the creak of leather. He was older than she had imagined, with threads of silver at his temples and crow's feet etched deep around his eyes. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand. He did not speak. He simply held it out to her. Her eyes flickered from the paper to his face. This was not Silas Stone. She knew Stone's face from the wanted posters in the last town, a bloated, piggish visage with a sneer permanently affixed to it. This man was his opposite, gaunt, contained, silent. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble for possibilities. Had Stone sold her already? Was this man an associate, a hired hand? She took the paper. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate brushwork of calligraphy, felt clumsy against the rough document. It was a deed of ownership. Her name, or the crude approximation of it they had given her, was written in Stone's florid, arrogant script. Below it, a transfer of title, signed by Stone and witnessed by the bartender. The property, one mailing, was now in the possession of Elias Thorne. The name meant nothing to her. She looked up at him, the paper a death sentence in her hand. Elias Thorne watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He seemed to be waiting for something. A protest, a plea, tears. She would give him none of it. She had learned long ago that such displays were currency for men like these. They fed on fear and desperation. She would starve him. She rose to her feet, the silk of her gown whispering against the dusty planks, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, not of his authority, but of the reality of her situation. This was the next step on her path, and she would walk it as she had walked all the others, with a core of iron resolve sheathed in quiet compliance. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes before the mask of stoicism settled back into place. He gestured with his head toward the horse. "Wagon lost a wheel. 5 miles out," he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together, a voice unused to conversation. It was the first time he had spoken. The words were not an apology, merely a statement of fact, a complication. There was another horse, a rangy, wild-eyed roan, tied to the back of his gelding. It was saddled, but it looked half wild, its nostrils flared, and its muscles bunched with nervous energy. He expected her to ride it. She looked from the horse to her dress. The fine silk, the intricate embroidery, it was made for courtly gardens and quiet tea rooms, not for the back of a beast like that. It was a cage of propriety and culture, utterly useless in this savage land. To refuse would be to show weakness, to invite contempt, or worse. To accept was to risk humiliation and injury. This was a test. She knew it instinctively. He was testing her limits, seeing what kind of creature Silas Stone had bartered away. Without a word, she walked to the horse. She placed one hand on the saddle horn, gathered the restrictive silk of her dress with the other, and swung herself into the saddle. The movement was not graceful, but it was efficient, devoid of hesitation. She had ridden before, in that other life, but those had been placid, well-trained ponies, not this brute. The roan sidestepped and snorted, but she held her seat, her back straight, her hands light but firm on the reins. She met Elias Thorne's gaze over the back of the horse. She had passed. He gave a curt nod, a motion so small it was almost invisible, and mounted his own horse. He did not speak again. He simply turned the gelding and led the way out of town, leaving the noise of the saloon, in the judgment of redemption, behind them. The journey began in silence. The town shrank behind them, becoming a smudge of weathered wood against the vast, indifferent canvas of the plains. Soon, even the memory of it was swallowed by the sheer scale of the landscape. The world was reduced to three elements: the endless sky, the scorched earth, and the silent man riding ahead of her. He was a pillar of constancy, his back straight, his head never turning. He moved with the unhurried competence of a man who belonged to this emptiness, who understood its rhythms and its dangers. The sun beat down relentlessly. Mei Ling felt the heat seep through the layers of silk, a suffocating blanket that drew the moisture from her body. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked and dry. The horse's gait was jarring, an uncomfortable rhythm that sent shivers of pain up her spine. Yet she made no sound of complaint. She focused on the back of the man in front of her, studying him. He rode with an easy grace, but there was a tension in his shoulders that never quite left. His head was always moving, his eyes scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the land, the flight of a hawk, the shape of a cloud, the distant puff of dust. He was a hunter, or the hunted. She could not tell which. He was a fortress of solitude, and she wondered what ghosts he was keeping at bay. Hours passed. The sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple. The heat finally began to break, replaced by a creeping chill that promised a cold night. Elias Thorne finally reined in his horse beside a small, gnarled cluster of cottonwoods huddled around a trickle of a creek. It was a meager oasis in the vast desolation. He dismounted and began to unsaddle his horse without a word. Mei Ling slid from the roan's back, her muscles screaming in protest. She stumbled, her legs unsteady after so long in the saddle, but caught herself before she fell. She would not show him that weakness. He built a small, smokeless fire with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. Every movement had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. He took a dented pot from his saddlebag, filled it with water from the creek, and set it on the fire to boil. He produced a strip of jerky and a hard biscuit, his meager supper. He did not offer her any. He seemed to have forgotten she was there, lost in his own world of silent ritual. She watched him, her hunger a dull ache in her stomach. It was another test, she realized. He was waiting to see if she would beg. She sat by the creek, cupping the cool water in her hands and drinking deeply. The water was her meal. It was enough. After he had finished his sparse meal, he took his canteen, filled it at the creek, and walked over to where she sat. He stopped a few feet away, a dark silhouette against the flickering firelight. He held out the canteen. His arm was steady, his face impassive. It was not an order, not a demand. It was a simple offer. She looked at the canteen, then at his face. It was the first gesture of provision, the first crack in the wall of his impenetrable silence. It was a small thing, a canteen of water. But in this desolate land, water was life. It was a recognition that she was a living thing, not just cargo. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who wrestled his living from the earth. She drank, the water a balm to her parched throat. "Zizi," she whispered, the words of foreign sound in the vast American silence. "Thank you." He did not respond, but she thought she saw his shoulders relax, just a fraction. He took the canteen back and retreated to his side of the fire, wrapping himself in his bedroll. Soon, the only sound was the crackle of the flames and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance. They arrived at his homestead as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky. It was not a ranch, not a farm. It was a scar of human existence on an otherwise untouched canvas of wilderness. A small, sturdy cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, stood against a backdrop of rising foothills, looking tiny and vulnerable beneath the immense, star-dusted sky. A small barn, a corral, and a few fenced-in patches of earth were the only other signs of life. The place was utterly isolated, a bastion against the world. Mei Ling's heart sank. She had traded the public cage of the town for a private one, a prison of solitude miles from anyone or anything. This was where she would live out her days, a ghost in this silent man's lonely world. Elias dismounted and led the horses toward the barn. He gestured for her to follow. She expected him to lead her into the main cabin, to the room that would be hers, or to the corner of the room where she would sleep on the floor. Instead, he walked past the main cabin to a smaller structure set about 50 yards away. It was little more than a shed, a tiny one-room shack that might have been a bunkhouse or a storage shed in a former life. He stopped at the door and pushed it open. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light chasing away the deep shadows. Inside, it was Spartan but immaculately clean. A narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket sat against one wall. A small table and a single chair were against the other. A stone fireplace, swept clean, dominated the back wall. He stepped inside and lit a lantern that sat on the table, its golden glow filling the small space with a warm, gentle light. He turned to her, his face half in shadow. He pointed to the inside of the heavy plank door. There was a thick iron bolt fixed to it, a lock, on the inside. He met her eyes, and for the first time she felt she understood something of him. This was not a prison. This was a sanctuary. He was giving her a space that was hers alone, a door she could lock against him, against the world. It was a gesture of honor so profound, so unexpected, that it left her breathless. It was a statement made without words. I will not harm you. You are safe here. He stepped back out onto the porch of the small cabin. A covered plate of food and a jug of water sat on a small crate next to the door. He must have prepared it before he left for town. He had known she was coming. He had prepared a place for her. He gave her one last lingering look, then turned and walked back to his own cabin, the crunch of his boots on the dry earth fading into the night. He did not look back. Mei Ling stepped inside her small refuge and slid the heavy bolt home. The sound of it locking into place was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding for months. She leaned against the door, the rough wood cool against her cheek, and for the first time since she had been stolen from her home, she allowed a single tear to trace a path through the dust on her face. The days settled into a silent, unspoken rhythm. Each morning before dawn, she would wake to find a small bucket of milk from his cow, a few eggs, and a stack of firewood on her small porch. He was a phantom provider, meeting her needs without ever intruding on her presence. She would watch him from her window as the sun rose, a solitary figure moving with relentless purpose. He worked from sunup to sundown, his energy a force of nature. He mended fences, his movements a symphony of practiced efficiency. He tended his small garden, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he coaxed life from the unforgiving soil. He cared for his animals with a quiet tenderness that seemed at odds with his harsh exterior. He was a man in constant motion, as if he feared what might catch up to him if he ever stood still. Mei Ling began to create a life within her four walls. She scrubbed the small cabin until the wood gleamed. She washed her single silk dress in the creek and mended it with thread she unraveled from the hem, her stitches tiny and perfect. She explored the surrounding foothills, her initial fear of the wilderness slowly replaced by a cautious curiosity. She found herbs and edible roots, things the silent man had overlooked in his own foraging. She was an observer, a student of this new harsh world and the man who inhabited it. She watched him in the evenings, when he would sit on his own porch, staring out at the vast emptiness, his face a portrait of a grief so profound it seemed to have become part of his very bones. She saw the ghost of another woman in the way he would sometimes stop and look at the house, a flicker of pain crossing his face before the stoic mask slammed back down. He was haunted, and his home was his mausoleum. She began to feel a desperate need to assert her own existence, to be more than just a passive recipient of his charity. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of her own agency. She was not just a mouth to feed, she was a person. One afternoon, she noticed his heavy work coat slung over a fence post, a long tear in the sleeve. That evening, after he had retreated into his cabin, she crept out and took the coat. By the light of her lantern, she mended it. Her stitches were not the rough work of a frontier seamstress. They were the fine, intricate work of an artist, a skill learned in a life of refinement. The seam was so perfect, it was nearly invisible. Before dawn, she returned the coat to the fence post. Later that morning, she watched from her window as he picked it up. He saw the mended sleeve and stopped. He ran his thumb over the stitches, his head bowed. He stood like that for a full minute, a statue in the morning light, before he put the coat on and went about his work. He did not acknowledge it, but something in the air between them had shifted. A week later, she made her first offering. Using the herbs she had gathered, she brewed a fragrant tea in a small pot she had found in the back of the barn. She carried it to his porch in the late afternoon, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was a boundary being crossed, an invitation to an interaction that went beyond the silent provision of food. She set the steaming cup on the step of his porch and retreated, watching from a distance. He came out, saw the cup, and paused. He looked toward her cabin, then picked up the cup. He drank the tea slowly, deliberately. It was an acceptance. A dialogue had begun, one spoken not in words, but in mended coats and cups of herbal tea. One evening, as the first hints of winter began to sharpen the air, he came to her cabin. He did not knock, but simply stood on the porch, waiting for her to sense his presence. She opened the door, her guard instantly up. He held a familiar piece of paper in his hand. The deed, the document that defined her as his property. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and steady in the fading light. He walked to the small fire pit she had built outside her door, where she cooked her meals. Without ceremony, without a single word, he dropped the deed into the embers. The paper curled, blackened, and then burst into a brief, bright flame before crumbling into ash. He turned back to her, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. "You are free," he said, his voice low but firm. "You owe me nothing. You can leave whenever you wish." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the vast, darkening landscape. "But winter is coming. The passes will be snowed in soon. It's dangerous to travel alone." He looked back at her, his meaning clear. Leaving was her choice, but staying was also her choice. He had given her back her life, her autonomy. He had burned the last chain that bound her. In that moment, he was no longer her owner, her keeper. He was simply Elias Thorne, a lonely man who had shown her a kindness more profound than any she had ever known. She gave him a deep, formal bow, a gesture of respect from her world, a world he knew nothing of. He seemed to understand it nonetheless. He gave a curt nod and walked back to his house, leaving her with the scent of burning paper and the astonishing, terrifying gift of freedom. The first snows came, a dusting of white that turned to a thick blanket overnight. The world became a silent, pristine expanse of white and gray. The cold was a living thing, a predator that seeped through the cracks in the logs and breathed frost onto the window panes. The threat of the elements became their shared enemy, forcing a new level of proximity. One morning, Elias found her collapsed on her porch, shivering violently, her skin pale and clammy. A fever had taken hold of her, swift and brutal. He did not hesitate. He lifted her into his arms. She was as light as a bundle of sticks, and carried her from her small sanctuary into the warmth of his main cabin. He laid her on his own bed, a large, sturdy frame he had built with his own hands, the bed he had once shared with his wife. The act felt like both a sacrilege and a necessity. He nursed her with a grim, focused determination. He brewed teas from the herbs she had shown him, forced broth between her lips, and sat by her side through the long, cold nights, placing cool cloths on her fevered brow. In her delirium, she spoke in her own language, words of fear and sorrow that he could not understand, but whose meaning he felt in his bones. He saw the ghosts that haunted her, the shadows of a past as painful as his own. As the fever raged, the carefully constructed walls between them dissolved. Her vulnerability was a raw, open thing, and his stoic reserve was breached by a fierce protective instinct that startled him. He was no longer just providing for a stranger. He was fighting for a life he had against all his intentions come to value. The fever broke after 3 days. Mei Ling woke to find herself in his bed, the room filled with the scent of wood smoke and pine. Elias was asleep in a chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, his face haggard with exhaustion. She saw him then not as a keeper or a stranger, but as a man, weary and burdened, who had chosen to save her. When he woke, their eyes met across the quiet room. The space between them was no longer filled with tension and uncertainty, but with a new fragile understanding. She was weak, but she was alive, and she was in his home. The separation was over. It was 2 weeks later, as she was slowly regaining her strength, that the real storm arrived. It was not a storm of snow and wind, but of men. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, dark figures moving purposefully against the endless white. Elias saw them first. He stood at the window, his body going rigid. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice flat and cold, the laconic tone gone, replaced by the sharp edge of a commander. Mei Ling looked past him and saw the riders. Her blood ran cold. On the saddle of the lead rider was a small embroidered flag, a green dragon on a field of jade. The Jade Dragons. Her past had found her. They were the enforcers for the powerful man she had fled in San Francisco, the man who had sold her to Silas Stone as punishment for her defiance. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to reclaim property or to erase it. "They are here for me," she said, her voice a bare whisper. He glanced at her, his eyes hard as flint. "They are on my land," he replied, as if that were the only answer that mattered. The fight was not a choice. It was an inevitability. He handed her a spare rifle, a heavy Winchester. "Can you use this?" he asked. She took the weapon, its weight familiar in her hands. She checked the action, the smooth, oiled click of the mechanism, a comforting sound from a past she had tried to forget. "I can," she said simply. He saw the way she held it, the way her body settled into a shooter stance, and knew it was the truth. The woman he had thought was a fragile doll was something else entirely. The battle began without warning. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the window frame. Elias was already moving, firing back from a different window, his movements fluid and precise. He was a practiced gunman, a man who knew the deadly geometry of a firefight. But the attackers were professionals. They spread out, using the barn and the corral for cover, creating a crossfire. They were patient, methodical. They were trying to pin him down. "They're trying to flank, from the north side, behind the barn," Mei-Ling said, her voice calm and clear. She had seen what he had missed, her mind assessing the battlefield with a strategist's cold logic. "One man. He will have a clear shot at the back door in a minute." Elias looked at her, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He nodded. "Cover the front." He moved toward the back of the cabin. Mei-Ling braced the rifle in the window, sighting down the long barrel. She did not aim for the men she could see. She aimed for a spot just beyond the corner of the barn. She slowed her breathing, became one with the weapon. A figure darted from behind the barn, moving fast. She fired. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. In the pristine snow, the running man crumpled and did not move again. A perfect shot, over 100 yards, at a moving target. In the silence that followed, she could feel Elias's stare on her back. He had seen the secret of who she was. A warrior trained from childhood to protect, to kill, was out. They fought together then, a silent, deadly team. They did not need to speak. They moved in concert, anticipating each other's actions. He would lay down covering fire while she moved to a new position. She would call out targets, her eyes sharp and her tactical sense unerring. They were two solitary broken people, a homesteader haunted by loss and an exile protector who had found a strange and lethal harmony in a crucible of violence. They were no longer a man and his ward. They were equals, partners in a desperate battle for survival. The fight lasted for nearly an hour. When it was over, the snow outside was stained with blood, and the three riders lay still. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the ragged sound of their own breathing. They stood in the dim light of the cabin, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and adrenaline. The danger had passed, but the world had been irrevocably changed. The final wall between them, the secret of her past, had been shattered. In the quiet aftermath, as the snow began to fall again, covering the evidence of the violence, a different kind of vulnerability settled over them. They were alone, alive, and stripped bare of all pretenses. That night, sitting by the fire, the shared warmth a fragile shield against the cold and the darkness, Elias finally spoke of the ghosts that haunted the cabin. "My wife Sarah," he began, his voice a low rumble. "She died in this room. And our son. A fever like yours, but it took them both." He stared into the flames, his eyes seeing a past he could never escape. "I built this place for them, for a future. When they were gone, it became a tomb. I came here to be left alone, to let the silence swallow me." He looked at her then, his gaze raw and unguarded. "It wasn't silent anymore, after you came." Mei-Ling did not offer empty words of comfort. She understood that some wounds were too deep for platitudes. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a simple grounding touch. It was an acknowledgement of his pain, a sharing of the burden of survival. They were two survivors, scarred by different pasts, who had found in each other an unexpected reason to keep fighting. His confession was a gift, an offering of his broken heart to match the revelation of her lethal skills. In the shared crucible of that day, they had forged a bond stronger than steel, a silent pact made in gunpowder and grief. The aftermath of the battle was a quiet, hushed affair. The world outside the cabin was transformed. The fresh snow, a clean slate covering the blood and death of the day before. Inside, the transformation was just as profound. The immediate danger was gone, but the emotional walls that had stood between them for so long had been permanently breached. The violence